Hello, students. Let's get started with Chapter 14. So, Chapter 14 is on the socio-emotional development of middle adults. And like we've talked about before, we've actually covered quite a few aspects that we're going to cover today in the chapter on physical development because there's not a whole lot of research on the socio-emotional development in middle adulthood. But let's get some key points that are happening at this time. Go over some myths that are myths about this time in life, and learn a little bit more about it. So, let's talk about personality theories. So we haven't talked much about personality theories in detail in this class. You might have heard about personality in the past. So essentially, personality is trying to pick out, well, originally the field was trying to pick out like traits that people had. So were you extroverted or are you introverted? What kind of a person are you, by kind of giving you these labels and assigning people different personality traits or personality profiles. More recently, we see that personality traits aren't really as stable as we originally thought. So in the past, we thought, well, if we figure out this personality profile, they're A, B, and C versus this person's C, B, A, or something like that, then we can kind of predict how they'll behave in any given situation. But we see that it's not really consistent how people behave across situations based on their personality profiles. So with that, the field is a little bit different now. It does look for different traits, but it doesn't look to profile people as much and expect them to be the same in different situations. But let's talk about some different approaches of looking at personality and how people act and behave and their kind of stable characteristics across middle adulthood. So Erikson thought that the whole middle adulthood section was all about generativity versus stagnation. So with that, he thought generativity was, well, generativity is any adult's desire to leave their legacy to the next generation, to give back to people. That can be done through work, that can be done through family. They're just generating things for people on the earth that are going to be here after they're gone, essentially. So stagnation, on the other hand, with my new computer setup, any bump on the table makes the video look different. All right, so stagnation is when an adult feels like they've done not as much for the next generation, that they have not given back, that they have not provided things to the world that's going to be here after them. So generativity can be developed in a lot of different ways. One of those ways is by having children. So having a biological offspring can provide a big sense of generativity, that you have literally put a being into the world that will continue after you. So children, grandchildren can be a really big impact. So if, say, an adult children are not having children, so they're not going to have grandchildren, that might kind of make them feel a little more stagnated than generative. So also you can do parental generativity. You can nurture and guide children, and it might not even be your own children. So there might be children that you mentor through work or volunteering. And so giving back in that kind of parental way, even if they're not your biological children, this also includes biological children though too, is another way people are generative. And then there's work generativity. So passing on skills or passing on your expertise, maybe writing a book or something like that to deliver the knowledge that you've attained over the course of your career to the next generation. Taking on an apprentice or multiple apprentices, helping train people in that field to take over after you leave. So that's another way people are generative. Then cultural generativity is leaving aspects of culture. So maybe the food has been really important to you about your culture. So you you teach people specifically how to cook different things. Or maybe the stories that your culture has passed down to you. Maybe those are really important for you to pass on. Those are other ways to be generative in that cultural context. So Erikson thought you either were generative or you were stagnated. You weren't moving forward, and you kind of had to pass this to move on through life. So, given Erikson's thoughts, how would you advise a middle-aged woman who has never had children of her own and fears she has little opportunity to leave a legacy? So if someone came to you as, say, a therapist or a friend and was feeling like they weren't being very generative, and that aspect of having biological children or that biological parentage was not part of their life, how would you recommend they go about being generative outside of having biological children? So think about that, maybe pause the video and answer that yourself. So generativity, when people have generativity, when they feel like they are being a positive influence on the world, leaving things behind, it's really highly correlated with well-being. So feeling like you are happy or content, as well as you have the things that you need, it's really highly correlated with that. It's correlated with positive social engagement with family, friends, and the communities in general. Oftentimes that generative action is with the communities you're with. So if you don't have your own children and you're being generative by volunteering with children in the community, that will obviously be putting you in that community more. So it's also related to having better health, also related to people with higher wisdom also tend to be more generative, or people that are more generative are ranked as having higher wisdom. So we talked about wisdom a few weeks ago, so I think that might make sense to you. So civic engagement is also really highly correlated with generativity. Civic engagement is essentially any kind of civic behavior that is pro-social for people around you, for the building up of the world. So essentially, civic engagement for an adolescent is just called civic engagement. If a late or middle adult is being civically engaged, oftentimes that's seen as generative. So with this, there have been different theories of personality development through adulthood. So Levingson's Seasons of a Man's Life was one of the first books that really tackled this subject, but it was a little problematic. He only interviewed middle-aged men, and there were only 40 of them. N equals 40, that means like sample size was 40. So some of the things that were found in that, though, were some conflicts in that tradition or transition from middle adulthood to late adulthood. So the idea of being young versus old, or feeling like you're young versus you're old, being destructive but versus being constructive in life, being masculine versus being feminine. So this one is as people grow older, as men specifically grow older, they notice some of the characteristics that they have and are maybe stronger or more useful at that time of life are things that they might have previously been considered as more feminine traits. So that goes back to ideas of gender and the social construction of gender there. So being attached to others versus being separated from them. And so you might see some of these things are really similar to other stages of life as well. So being close to others versus being separate from them is really important for adolescents, for early adults, for people in general, and we'll talk about that too, about being close to people. So success really depends on how effectively a person combines both sides of that continuum in their own life, according to the findings of this study, which again was a good first step, but didn't use a whole lot of people and didn't use a wide variety of people in middle and late adulthood. So the idea that this middle adulthood or late adulthood is a certain age time is something that hopefully has been challenged for you during this period of learning about lifespan development. That, for example, we saw there was a lot of physical development features that were really similar and cognitive abilities that stayed really close to the same until into the 70s. So the idea is that maybe we should change the ages that we're grouping people. So maybe we should say, well, the early adult transition phase is about 17 to 22. Maybe middle adulthood is more like 33 to 40. And then maybe there's a transition there from about 28 to 33, and entry to early adulthood. So there's these kind of transitional phases where you're kind of transitioning into that next phase of life. So with that, it might have some other transitions all the way into late adulthood. And that's kind of the point of these slides here, is maybe we should think about these not as really static phases of being from, say, 35 to 55 for middle adulthood. Maybe there are more phases within there, and maybe some transitional periods where there's similarities between those transition periods. But again, because this is an area of the lifespan that doesn't have as much research, it's hard to really narrow down and say, okay, yep, all these patterns are really similar from people from about 50 to 55, just because we don't have as much research on that time period, because not as many researchers are interested in it. So with that, let's talk about the myth of a midlife crisis. So how pervasive are midlife crises? How often do you hear about them? Have you ever met anybody who you thought was going through a midlife crisis? Maybe a parent, an uncle, something like that. So the 40s are a decade of reassessing and reordering and re-recording truth about the adolescent and adult years. So we talked about this in identity development, that over the course of the lifespan, people's identities change. Careers change, they have children, they have grandchildren, they choose a new kind of career path. Different things happen that make their identity change. And so a lot of times this might look to people like a midlife crisis. But really only a minority of adults actually experience a midlife crisis that's really kind of a traumatic experience for them, that is a difficult experience for them. Most people go through life just gradually changing their identity as time goes on, rather than having a big crisis and a really big dramatic change where their behavior and personality to outside people looks very dramatically different. So that prevalence and the severity of that crisis is really exaggerated. So the media kind of portrays it a lot. It's in stories and movies and books, but it's not actually that common, and it's usually not that bad either. So from early adulthood through late adulthood, most people's happiness and well-being increases. It's kind of a slow, which direction are you looking? So I guess it could go either way, right? A slow, steady climb through late adulthood. So this is a good video if you want to get another example of midlife crisis versus identity. I'm not going to watch it right now with the group, but it's in your lecture slides. So with that, one thing I mentioned is that personality psychology has kind of moved away from looking for characteristics or traits that are really stable across different contexts. And the main reason for that is because we see a lot of individual variation in different contexts. So middle-aged adults tend to interpret, shape, alter, and give meaning to their life. So that's kind of a really packed sentence. So they can interpret any given situation they're in specific ways. They can change situations by their own behavior or inputting energy into them. They can alter things, and they can give it different meanings depending on what's important to them at the time as well. So in a third of the cases where individuals report having a midlife crisis, it's usually triggered by a significant life event, such as job loss, having financial problems, or a big illness, rather than just one day waking up realizing, oh, now I'm 45 or I'm 50 or something like that, and having a midlife crisis for that. It'd be something like, oh, I am 45 and the career path that I was on my entire life is now gone because I was fired from that job or something like that. So another approach to personality is the life events approach. It's more contemporary, so it's a little more modern, and it takes into account more of these different contexts. So it basically looks at how life events influence an individual's development. So it's really dependent on things like the life events itself. So a life event could be something like marriage, losing or gaining a job, the birth of a child, or maybe the marriage of a child, and in individual mediating factors. So things like your health, your intelligence, family support, and then also your own adaptation. So do you have some protective factors, or do you have some risk factors? Are you resilient to these changes? So those kinds of things. There's also the life stage. So where are you in life? Are you having really poor health, but you're also really close to late adulthood? Because that might make more sense, and your interpretation of that might be different than if you're having really poor health at, say, 40. So the socio-historical context, what's going on in the world around you and the time period, and then all the interactions between those. So what is going on in the world around you socio-historically, as well as is that affecting your health and access to health care, things like that. And that might make it better or worse if you are, say, having health problems. So if a person's in poor health, in poverty, and has very little family support, all those risk factors increase the outcome or increase the likelihood of more negative outcomes. So a person who is in good health, is in high SES, and has a lot of family support, it will tend to be more protective and lead to some of those more positive outcomes long term. So that's what this life events approach. You can probably see some tie-ins with the relational developmental systems theory, and it's one kind of way to look at those different contexts and how they're interacting. So here's that Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory, that we have all these systems that are changing as we are also changing. So an individual, so at this point they're a little older, they're in late adulthood or middle adulthood, they still have a microsystem, so their family probably looks different now. They probably have adult children, they might even have some grandchildren. Their religious community may look different than it did when they were in, say, adolescence. Their workplace might be different than, say, adolescence or early adulthood. They might not be in school. They probably still have friends that they are interacting with. So that the microsystem is now different, and it's going to affect them in different ways than it would, say, in adolescent or early adult. But these systems are still in place. They just look different at different times in the lifespan. So this is also similar and can be seen in Lerner's relational developmental systems theory. So you still got, right here it says child, because that's the original model, what it was written about. But you can also put this as a middle adult, or yourself. So yourself, you have your own biology, you have your own personality, your own temperament, your own health and cognition. So based on that, you also have a social network. You might have parents. You might have a school network. I mean, if you're in this class, you obviously have a school network. We're in class right now. You probably have a work network. You might have a marriage network or a relationship. And so these different relationships can affect you, you can affect them, they can affect one another. So if you're having a hard time at work, you might be more stressed coming home to your relationship, and that might put more strain on that relationship, as an example. And then within these, you also have community that's affecting you, the society, the culture at large, and then time. These things change over time. So this is kind of a review. We've talked about this developmental cascade. So these different risk factors for middle adults can lead to maybe some more positive outcomes on this side versus some more negative outcomes if there's risk factors versus protective factors in their lives. So some drawbacks of this life events approach are that some people say it places too much emphasis on change and doesn't look at stability all that much. Since this developmental contextual systems theory is really the perspective I'm coming at it from, I see that kind of argument that you're not looking at the stability. And my counter is, well, there isn't a whole lot of stability in a lot of cases. Some things in life can be pretty stable, or for some individuals, something might be really stable over time. But there is always a potential for change, for growth, for loss, things like that. So, and also another, I think, more valid criticism of this life events approach is that it might not be the events themselves that are the primary sources of stress or protection, or so that these events themselves are the protective factor versus the risk factor. It's maybe more daily experiences that are more sources of stress. And I would say that's probably true, but it also, again, you get the problem there. If it's daily experiences, those can change dramatically, right? So your context from one day to a week from now might be very different. So middle-aged adults do tend to experience more overloaded stressors that involve juggling too many activities at once. We talked about this a little bit with the physical development. Middle adults might have adult parents come to live with them and be taking care of them, as well as still taking care of their own children, maybe their adult children. So some aspects of personal control do increase with age, while others might decrease. So with that, stress is handled differently in middle adulthood based on gender. So fight or flight is a type of behavior men engage in when they experience stress. So they either kind of attack that stress head on, or they kind of run away from that. They might become aggressive, socially withdrawn, or drink more alcohol. Versus for women, they tend to model a tend and befriend. So it's a type of behavior when they're experiencing stress, either trying to befriend people that are causing the stress. So if it's relational stress in, say, a family or a neighborhood, they might try to fix those kinds of relationships. Or they might use their other relationships to kind of support and be a protective factor against the stresses that they're facing. So they're seeking social alliances either for that specific stressor and problem or just as a general support. So with that, we've got a lot of longitudinal studies to talk about here. So Costa and McCrae's Baltimore study focused on the big 5 factors of personality, and we'll talk about those. Those are kind of broad characteristics. So at one time, personality theory was looking to find lots and lots of very specific characteristics. Some personality assessments had upwards of over 100 personality traits that you might have and be measured on, versus the big 5 has, surprise, surprise, 5. So we'll talk about those. So with that, one of those is openness, and that is being open to new experiences. And with that, are you more imaginative or practical? Are you interested in variety versus routine? So someone who's more open would be more interested in having wider variety. So different types of movies or different types of music, different types of experiences, versus someone who's a little bit less open might want to just go the same restaurants all the time or not try new musics, things like that. Conscientiousness is another of those big 5 personality factors. And so that is, how conscientious are you of other people? Are you careful, or are you careless? Are you disciplined? Are you impulsive? So it's this conscientious characteristic kind of encompasses quite a few other personality characteristics that would have in the past been their own separate thing. But now we kind of pooled them into this general category of conscientiousness. Agreeableness is whether you're more trusting or suspicious, more soft-hearted or ruthless or helpless or uncooperative. So how agreeable are you as a person generally? Neuroticism is mostly about emotional stability. So someone who has a lot of mental illnesses, they would probably rate pretty highly on neuroticism, especially if they're very anxious or if they're very insecure. So that would be ranking higher on neuroticism. Extroversion is one that we hear a lot, but we don't always understand just in lay talking about it. Extroversion is one, whether you're sociable, so wanting to be around other people, or if you're wanting to be more by yourself. It also goes to how extroverted you are with, say, being affectionate to other people as well. And it's also about, like, do you feel more energized by being alone reading a book or by being around a bunch of other people? So with that, Costa and McCrae worked with those 5 broad traits, that big factor personality model, to look at middle adults. So we'll actually watch this video to get a little bit better sense of what these characteristics are right now.
Field of psychology has been trying to understand all those personality traits that make you a unique and special little snowflake. Hi guys, I'm Lacey Green, and this is D News. It's called personality psychology, and it's a booming field of research you're bound to hear about in any human psych class. One of the most well-researched and respected personality models in the field is Costa and McCrae's Big 5. This model evaluates how strong a person is on 5 different axes. Let's take a look-see at those traits. Trait number 1 is openness to experience. This trait describes how open or closed your thinking is. Highly open people are intellectually curious. They love art and science. Open people appreciate emotion, unusual ideas, imagination, adventure, and of course, having new experiences. People with low scores tend to have more traditional interests. They prefer familiarity over doing something new, and they don't really like change. Trait number 2 is conscientiousness. Highly conscientious people are basically those annoying overachievers who are always on top of it. They're disciplined, responsible, and good at planning ahead. A high score on conscientiousness suggests a strong ability to regulate and control your behavior. Low scores tend to be more impulsive and unorganized. Hot mess status. Trait number 3 is extroversion. People tend to think of extroversion and introversion as how outgoing you are, but it's actually about how you get your energy. High scorers, the extroverts, feel recharged and energized by going out and being around people. They like parties and chit-chatting. Low scorers or introverts feel rejuvenated and energized by spending time alone. They tend to be quieter, lower key, and more deliberate. They go to a party and they have to recover the next day. This is sometimes confused with shyness, but shyness is about comfort socializing. Introversion and extroversion are about the amount of socializing you need to do your best and to feel your best. Trait number 4 is agreeableness. Highly agreeable people are considerate, friendly, and helpful. They just wish we could all get along, guys. They make sacrifices for others, and they assume others are good people. Low scorers or highly disagreeable people are suspicious, distant, and uncooperative. They place self-interest above getting along. They don't care as much about other people's well-being, and they're less likely to help you out. Basically, they're assholes. I'm just kidding, but really. And last but not least, trait number 5 is neuroticism. This trait measures emotional stability. Highly neurotic people are more prone to negative emotions like anxiety, anger, depression. They're easily stressed out, they're reactive, and they're more likely to be frustrated in day-to-day life. Low scorers are more calm and collected. They don't really sweat the small stuff. They're emotionally stable and balanced. Now, for a long time, it was thought that these 5 traits held true across regions and cultures. We've witnessed them in action across the world, but recently, researchers found an isolated Bolivian farming community where for the first time, it doesn't seem to apply. For this community, there are only 2 major traits: socially beneficial behavior and industriousness. This makes an interesting suggestion about personality. If there are less developed areas where personality trends are different, society may play a stronger role in encouraging or discouraging the expression of personality traits than we once thought. Food for your brain. So guys, I'm gonna put a link.
Alright, so in that video there was a link to one of the Big 5 personality trait assessments, so if you want, you can go and do that. But let's talk about how it's important in middle adulthood. So again, these are the general traits. You can see how a lot of things might fall under either openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness. So with it, they are pretty universal across most cultures that we've studied, but like in the video said, maybe not in all cultures. So, and the problem is that the more broad the traits are, the more useless they are for predicting really specific behaviors in specific situations. So if you know someone, let's say they're all on a scale of 100, is a 90 in openness, a 20 in neuroticism, a 30 in agreeableness, a 40 in extroversion, and I might have said agreeableness twice, and a 50 in conscientiousness, well, that can give you some kind of general idea of that person. You can correlate that well with, say, things like well-being, or be able to do measurements like that. But it makes it really hard to predict specific behaviors in a situation like when someone is in need of help on the side of the road versus when someone drops books in front of them in the middle of a hallway, versus a specific behavior like their 2 best friends are arguing at a bar and seems to be getting more and more heated. So when you get more specific kind of situations like that, it can be harder to make more specific predictions from these more general traits. So that's one of the problems that psychology in general has is, well, how specifically do we want to measure this thing for making really specific predictions versus how broadly do we want to measure this to get a better sense of how it works more stably across lots of different situations. So it's kind of a catch-22. Which one are you more concerned with doing? For myself, a lot of my measurements, I'm looking for a lot of change, so I'm all right with seeing really specific things at one specific time and then tracking that over time. And then from that you can build sort of a more broad similarities across time, but I am more interested in that more specifics rather than these broad categories. So some of these Berkeley longitudinal studies looked at middle adults and how they changed over time. So in their intellectual orientation, self-confidence, and openness to more new experience, those were some of the more stable things. So they were those who were high in self-confidence or high in being open to new experience. Over the middle adulthood, they still were that way. Characteristics that changed the most were the extent to which individuals were either nurturing or hostile. So some people that were really hostile at the beginning were really nurturing at the end, versus some that were really nurturing at the beginning. At the end of these years of study, again, longitudinal is following those same people over time. Some of those people who were nurturing in the beginning were really hostile at the end. and also whether or not they had good self-control. So that is a really interesting finding. We tend to think of self-control being something that's developed in earlier childhood and can stay pretty stable, and it can, but people can improve or even lose capacity for self-control across adulthood as well. So it's still a skill that can be practiced and improved at any time, essentially. So another study was of socially advantaged Harvard graduates born in about 1920 and compared to some socially disadvantaged inner city men and then intellectually gifted women born in about 1910. So comparing these groups. So with that, some of the findings there were that people became more stable in their personality at midlife, so there wasn't as much change as quickly at this time, and that people get better at interacting in ways that promote the stability with their environments as they age. Some of that is because things like career and family setting starts to be more stable. So as an example, an early adult might move to a new apartment a couple times throughout early adulthood. But then once you have children, maybe it's better to not move so much for them, for example. So I remember when I first got married, I moved literally every year, but it's been a lot less frequent more recently, as I'm in a new house that I just moved into like a week ago, which is why there's still pictures on the floor over here that are not hung up yet. But the really cool ones here are hung up. Those are probably our favorites. Anyway, totally not relevant. So that doesn't mean that change is absent throughout midlife, because personality is still affected by things like social context. So one setting versus another setting, maybe you're at let's say two parties. So one, maybe a child's birthday party versus the other adults partying without children around. So those contexts are pretty different. Your behavior and your personality might show up differently in those two contexts. So new experiences, so especially if it's something that you've never experienced before, your personality might, or the way that your personality is displayed or the way that you behave might not be as consistent with the ways that you've behaved in the past. And then also socio-historical changes. If all of a sudden there's a crazy pandemic in the world, your personality and the way that you behave might be different than it was even just a few weeks or months ago, as an example. So with that, there is a lot of plasticity in personality. And with that, there is plasticity in identity as well. So we're kind of talking about personality, we're talking about identity here. There's a lot of overlap there. So you might say a person's identity is the things that are important to them. Some of their personality characteristics might be important to their identity, right? But these things can change throughout life, not just in adolescence when they're developing identity, not just in early adulthood, but throughout adulthood, there's still a lot of change that can happen. Even though there tends to be a little more stability throughout middle adulthood, there still can be a lot of change and a lot of variation between the settings and situation that you're in. So with that, let's talk about close relationships in middle adulthood. So one is that security, loyalty, and mutual emotional interests are more important in middle adulthood than they tend to be rated in importance earlier in the lifespan. So most married individuals are satisfied with their marriages during midlife, and divorce rates have decreased for young adults, but actually have increased more recently for middle-aged adults. So those kind of facts seem to contradict each other, but just on average, more individuals are satisfied in marriages at midlife, but we do see an increase in divorces in middle adulthood. So empty nest syndrome is something that is common as children are leaving the home. So it's fairly common to have a decrease in marital satisfaction after those children leave the home. Parents derive a lot of satisfaction from their children, a lot of meaning. We've talked about meaning, we've talked about purpose, so they can have a lot of purpose around raising their children. So when that's gone, that might be a new step of changing their identity. So now they do not have to necessarily raise this teenager or these children directly. They're kind of watching them from afar. So now what are they doing? They're in a home where it's just them and their partner maybe. They have their friends. What are they going to focus on now that they don't have to be so focused on those children that they were raising? So identity might change at that time, and those kinds of changes can lead to lower marital satisfaction. So refilling of that emptiness is common. So bringing more children in, bringing grandchildren in, things like that, to kind of fill up that space that is left from those children being gone. So with that, that might bring other risk factors too, such as like a loss of your own privacy. If you have all your grandkids in the house, then you have to take care of grandkids rather than having your own time to yourself. So sibling relationships and friendships in middle adulthood are really similar. So friendships as well as siblings, or they can be really similar. So those siblings might be friends, those friends would be friends. So sibling relationships, though, in middle adulthood might be really close, although they might be apathetic. They can also still be really rivalrous. So some of those things, some of those features exist in other times of the lifespan, but those still exist. So you can still be rivals with a sibling even in middle adulthood. You can still be just not close to siblings in middle adulthood, or you could be extremely close to siblings in middle adulthood. So friendships that have endured over the adult years tend to be deeper and tend to deepen and continue on through the adult years. So I guess if you've got friends up to this point, to middle adulthood, you're probably going to keep them. You've already been through a lot with them. You've seen changes in each other, had identity changes and changes in your life that you've already been through with them, and this goes for siblings as well. So you will tend to keep those same friends. So grandparenting is something that can be new in middle adulthood. It can happen earlier on in the lifespan or even later, but it tends to be around middle adulthood. So with that, sometimes parent or grandparents step in to raise children. Sometimes that's because of children's divorces, adolescent pregnancy, or drug use. And so a lot more grandparents are in the US are taking that role as immediate parents. In some other cultures, there's more of a community aspect of families, and so a family will be living with grandparents as well as with some uncles and aunts. And so in those kinds of settings, there is still maybe more grandparenting, parenting directly being like the primary caregiver, but it doesn't look as different as it does in the US because there's more commonly grandparents that are part of that direct involvement with the young children. So full-time grandparenting has been linked to health problems for middle adults, things like depression and stress, because physically, maybe you don't have as much energy, don't have as much time. There are all these other stresses that we talked about with physical development that we don't tend to think of that middle adults have. And so with all those stresses combined, it can be a big risk factor for a lot of negative health outcomes. So with that, middle-aged adults do express a lot of responsibility between generations. This goes back to that generativity we talked about. Middle adults play important roles in the lives of the young adults as well as older adults. So they are kind of a connective factor there, trying to be generative towards early adults, maybe taking care of and building relationships, and maybe even still getting mentored from older adults. So relationships between aging parents and their children on average are characterized by ambivalence more than other things. So aging parents and their children tend to be a little more ambivalent than you would maybe expect on average. So with that, with intergenerational relationships, there are differences in genders. So mothers and daughters tend to have closer relationships during the adults. So let's say a middle adult daughter and an older adult mother, they tend to have a closer relationships than a father and son. Married men are involved more with their wives' families than their own on average. Again, this can be very individual, but just on average, married men tend to be more involved with their wives' families than their own in middle adulthood. The grandparent and grandchild relationships, the mother's intergenerational ties tend to be more influential. Again, this is on average. So for the grandchild, their mothers, the grandparents on their mother's side, tend to be more influential in their life. So let's talk about other people mattering. So this first video is a good one, but there's some aspects of it I don't really like. This is Chris Peterson, one of the founders of positive psychology, talking about how important other people matter, or how important other people are. So with that, this is a really important key piece in middle adulthood, and as you'll see in later adulthood, it gets even more important for building those relationships and keeping up cognitive faculties rather than losing those capacities. So let's watch this.
Of religion. However, there are secular sources of the work I do as a psychologist is within the field known as positive psychology, which has a general definition as the scientific study of what makes life worth living. In addition to happiness, positive psychologists are also interested in talents and abilities, in our passions, the things that we're really interested in. What gets us out of bed in the morning? Whether we're passionate about work, about leisure activities, about our family. My own work is focused on strengths of character, positive traits like kindness and teamwork and sense of humor.
So those character strengths you can think of as a positive psychology version of personality traits. So kindness, humor, those are characteristics that we see are not always stable across situations. It's kind of a positive psych view of personality, looking at specifically positive characteristics that are similar to personality traits that we might look at.
Psychologists are also interested in the institutions that enable the good life, family, schools, good workplaces, healthy communities. What is the relationship of happiness to a life well lived? I would say that happiness is often an indicator that you're living well, but it's not a perfect indicator. A lot of the things that we do that make life worth living, raising children, for instance, doesn't necessarily make us happy. Not in the short run. In the long run, yes. In the short run, absolutely not. It's hard work. Why do we do it? Because it's the right thing, not just because it puts a momentary smile on our face or makes us feel gleeful. Happiness is a product of our pursuits, not necessarily the pursuit of happiness per se, but the pursuit of other things that make life worth living. So if you take very seriously your work or your family or your community, if you pursue the good in those domains, guess what? You're going to be happy as a result. Sometimes when I give a talk and I tell the audience, if you really don't want to listen to me for the next hour, listen to me for 5 seconds, because I'll tell you what positive psychology is all about. Other people matter, period. I'm done with my talk. Anything that builds relationships between and among people is going to make you happy. Now the other route, it's probably related, is to have a sense of meaning and purpose about your life, to see yourself as connected to something larger than yourself. Now, for some folks, their religion can provide a sense of meaning and purpose, and positive psychologists are not shy about acknowledging the importance of religion. However, there are secular sources of meaning and purpose as well. Making the earth hospitable for future generations. Again, friends and family, or here at the University of Michigan, it's pretty exciting for me to be reminded that my day job is talking to the best and the brightest young people in the world. Sometimes I have to remind myself of that when I didn't find a parking place in the morning, but
So from that interview, there's a few things that are kind of irrelevant to the main discussion of middle adulthood and positive psychology, but it is kind of an overview of his relationship with the field of positive psychology. So useful to know, but not specifically important for everything here. The main things there are what is meaningful to people. So raising families, building relationships, getting closer to people. Those are the things that give people the most meaning in their life and increase well-being. Fostering institutions or building institutions that can help people build good relationships. That's a big point of positive psychology. So an example of that would be trying to build schools or universities that do a better job of bringing people together rather than building rivalries and things like that. So building school environments that are positive for everybody, where people feel safe to be themselves and work together on things versus trying to be really competitive and see who's getting to the top. So that's one of the things positive psychology does. And that's one of the things that's really important for middle adulthood as well. And as we'll see going into later adulthood, that aspect of other people, being involved with other people, seeing other people regularly can really help improve the cognitive performance that people have. So we'll do that and talk about that more in chapter 15.